tonight's speaker, our very own Sara Allen. Sara Allen, she is somebody who, she's one of our senior librarians, but more importantly, she's been doing DNA genealogy research since before it was trendy. All right, so she knows a lot about the subject. She's as close to an expert as you're ever going to get on DNA research. She started her own family history research when she was 11. She has a master's degree in library and information science from Dominican University. And Sara Allen has been with us since 2013. But before that, she was a genealogy librarian and the assistant manager of the local and family history services at the St. Joseph County Public Library in South Bend. So she has a lot of great experience to share with all of you. And tonight will be just definitely a fun program where we can all just kind of have a nice little chat. So Sara, it is about that time. If you'd like to say hello.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Great. Well, yeah, welcome everybody. As Elizabeth said, this is kind of going to be a informal chat, and we can talk about what you want to talk about, or we can talk about what I want to talk about. If nobody has any questions, I mean, I'll fill the time. But we have a couple questions already, and let me just go and see what those say, and I will see. Okay, all right. So the first one is a good one, but I think I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna show you my DNA ethnicity results. So specifically tonight, I said we were gonna talk about ethnicity results. So we're gonna try to talk about that first. And if we have other questions on other topics that we get a chance to get to, we will, but if we don't, we won't. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen and I'm going to show you my own ethnicity results. Okay, so everybody sees those?
Very Germanic Europe.
Yes, well, I have to move them up a bit. Okay, let's see here. All right, I'm fiddling around with my Zoom settings here. Sorry, I got to be over here so I can actually do the little sliders on the side. So this is Ancestry. This is Ancestry DNA. And as you can see, I went up here to DNA and I went to DNA story. That's what Ancestry calls it. And Ancestry is one of the 4 major companies that will show you your ethnicity estimate, and the others would be 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA's Family Finder test. And so all 4 of these companies will test your autosomal DNA. And that is what we're looking at here, is part of the autosomal DNA results is your ethnicity estimate. And it's the part that people get really excited about. And that's great. I'm glad, that people are getting excited about it. I'm glad that it interests people. And it kind of brings more people in to do DNA testing, because they tell their friends, oh, I did my DNA and I found out that I was Scottish or whatever, and I didn't know that, and it was really exciting. And so then their neighbor wants to do their DNA so they can find out, if they're Scottish or, something like that. And so it's great. It brings in more people to do DNA testing. And we like that, because I like to do the DNA testing because I want to find genealogical links. So I'm not as interested in the ethnicity part of it. But when new people test, it gets them into the database, and if they're a match with me, then I can, communicate with them and talk with them. They might be interested in their ethnicity, but I'm interested in their genealogy. And I'm like, oh, who are you? Who are your family? It says we're a match. That kind of thing. So love it when new people test. So the ethnicity estimate is kind of the more speculative area of the DNA testing. Now, each of the companies is going to tell you what they mean by their ethnicity estimate. So you need to read whatever company you used, you need to read their website. So right here on this Ancestry website, you can see that there's a little question mark up here. If I click on that, it brings me over here to take a survey. It brings me to a whole help screen that says Ancestry, DNA, ethnicity, regions, and communities tips. And it tells you all sorts of stuff about the ethnicity and how they came up with it and so forth. So you definitely want to do that. You want to click on that question mark, especially if you're having some like issues with understanding your DNA, what's going on with your ethnicity results. So you want to make sure you're reading the website and just getting all of the information that they put together for you. So let's see, is there any of these that we want to look at? Nah, okay, I'm not really, unless somebody asks us a question about this, I'm going to go back. So now we're back at my ethnicity estimate. Everyone can see that again? Yeah, okay. Yep. All right. So that was just hitting on that question mark up at the top there. Then over here, right under where it says your DNA looks most like DNA from these 8 world regions, it tells you we compare your DNA against a worldwide reference panel to see which populations your DNA most looks like. And then it says, how do we calculate this? This is another place where you can click on this right here, this link, and it will open up in a new screen. And it will tell you more information about your ethnicity estimate and how exactly it was calculated. So let's go down the screen here. So it says, this is my DNA looks most like the DNA from these 8 world regions. And you can see they're going from highest percentage down to lowest percentage. And I am getting in a roundabout way to Terry's question. So Terry put a question in the question and answer. And we're getting to your question, Terry. I'm just roundabouting getting there. So you can see they're in order as, and you would think, theoretically speaking, that I have the most Germanic DNA and the least Irish DNA, right? That's how you would read this probably, because that's logical, right? So, however, if we click on these, if I click on Germanic Europe, it brings me to this screen here, and it tells me that it's primarily located in Germany, but Germanic Europe can, of course, include these other regions over here. Let me get rid of this tree thing that's showing up.
Yeah, I was about to say, what is Ancestry's definition of Germanic? Because that is going to vary based on the time frame when your ancestors actually lived there.
And that's what you need to read this whole description here for. It tells you kind of about Germanic, and then it says down at the very bottom, read the full history. And so there'll be a full history of what Ancestry thinks about Germanic Europe. But basically the map is showing you that they're primarily talking about the area in the yellow, that darker yellow, but this lighter yellow area are also Germanic areas. And so if your people lived in Poland, Czechia, Austria, Hungary, or this is probably Slovenia, Switzerland, Belgium, this is part of Denmark, I think up here. Anyways, it's incorporating different countries. France, part of France. But the other thing that I was going to say when I was talking about percentages is read this right here. Your ethnicity estimate is 27%, but it can range from 20% to 47%. So this means that I could only be 20% Germanic, according to this, or I could be up to 47% Germanic. And so they think it's around 27%, but it's a range. And then there's a little tiny I there, and you can click on that, and get more information. And basically they tell you that that they calculated it by making multiple comparisons of your DNA to the reference panel. And sometimes I had only 20% Germanic DNA when they ran it, and other times I had 47%. And they made a mathematical calculation that it was most likely around 27%. But this is all, as you can see, this is all kind of speculative. This is kind of squishy. It's not like really definitive. It's based on mathematical probabilities is what it's based on. And if they decide to change their calculations at some future point, or take a different probability, then this is going to change as well. So if you've had your DNA in one of these companies for a long period of time, you know that your percentages have changed over time. I don't remember what my first ethnicity estimate was, but I've been an Ancestry customer for probably over 10 years. So I've had about 3 or 4 or 5 ethnicity estimates from Ancestry, and they were all been rather different from one another. The percentages have been different. The highest one that I have is been different. So if we go back, like right now, it looks like Germanic Europe, like that's the highest level that I have. And then it says Scottish is my second highest. But again, if we click on Scottish, we're going to get in here and learn that I could really be anywhere from 10% to 28% according to their calculations. So my Scottish could be a lot lower than what it is looking like with the 24%. So for each of those, you can go in there yourself and look at your own ethnicity estimate. So what that means is, and this goes to Terry's question. So Terry, I'm circling, I'm getting there. Terry's question was about small amounts like this: France 6%, or Eastern Europe 6%, Baltics 3%, Ireland 2%. So if you click on Ireland, if I click on Ireland right now, it's going to tell me that I could actually be 0% Irish according to this model. And again, this is a mathematical probability. It's not entirely accurate about my Irish ethnicity. I mean, you know, I think it's unknown at this point how much Irish I really am. But according to these calculations by Ancestry, I'm between 0% and 7% Irish. And so that's telling you, Terry, that I could be 0% Irish, right? And so if you have a 2% or something, one of those low percent ethnicities, you want to go in and look at this and click on it and see what it tells you. So this Eastern European and Russian one, let's see, it says 6%, but if I go down here, it says I'm 0 to 19%. So again, I could be 0% Eastern European according to this calculation. Now, I know that I'm not 0% Eastern European because my grandma was Eastern European, 100%. So I really should be about 25% Eastern European. And you can see that they're calculating I could be up to 19%, but they're thinking that I'm really about 6%. And I think they're a little off on this calculation. So basically, Terry, that was a long-winded explanation of that if you go down to these lower level ones, you can see that the probability is that you could be 0% of that ethnicity. So that is certainly a possibility. So I would say, you didn't say whether it was something unexpected or not. And that's the other thing. You can see how my ethnicity is 100% European, and that would be what I expect it to be. I don't have any family stories about being another ethnicity. Well, I mean, I have a couple Indian princess stories, but those are pretty, you know, I don't know. I didn't put much credence.
I feel like that's really common, especially in the Midwest.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it really is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And probably the South, maybe. I don't know. Do you hear it?
Depending on where in the South. But I mean, I will say as far as like you were talking about how they can, all of these, ethnicity estimates can change for some perspective. My mother, when she first did her DNA test several years ago, it was like 60% Ireland and England, Northwestern Europe, a smidge of Germanic Europe, a smidge of Scotland, and that was it. Fast forward 4 or 5 years, and I get into her ancestry account and look at her ethnicity results, and now there are all these percentages for different countries in Africa. And I think as we get more people testing, those numbers are going to change. You might have other places popping up. The last time Ancestry updated their ethnicity estimate, it said that my dad had, I think it pulled up a percentage of like Norway for my dad, but didn't for my aunt. So like you said, Sarah, it's really kind of wishy-washy.
Yeah, it is. So what I was going to say is I wasn't expecting to be any other ethnicities. I didn't expect to be Native American. I didn't expect to be African. I didn't expect to be Asian. I expected to be European, 100% European. And that's what Ancestry has me as. So if I did have some African DNA on here, or if I did have some Native American DNA on here, that would be unexpected. And it would also be, I think, more significant. So basically, a European person who is truly 100% European should have European results here. And so when you find somebody who's all of a sudden showing, a different non-European result, and you didn't expect that, then that should be looked into. You need to look into it, even if it is a really small amount. So I just got done telling you that I wouldn't worry about this 2% Irish, but that's because I'm European and I expect to be European. I expect to be an amalgamation of all these European groups. And so I'm not really worried about, what specific European group I am. I just know that I am European and that my results are showing that I am. But if it did say that I was 2% African or something like that, I would definitely want to look into that because that is unusual and it is an unexpected result.
Yeah, I think for my mom, it started as 2% and then it changed even more because it started adding specific countries. So now it's like a total of 6 between 3 different countries. But I know the story.
Yeah, explain a little bit about that if you don't mind.
Yeah,
that was not unexpected for you.
Well, it was unexpected, but
okay.
Well, let me explain. So my great-grandfather, he was a very secretive man. His mother was, my mother said that his mother was Cajun. She was not Cajun. She was Creole. So my family's from the New Orleans area, but specifically my great-grandfather was from St. John the Baptist Parish, which is just outside of the city. And his mother was bilingual. His grandmother only spoke French. These were all darker complected people. My grandmother, my sister and I always suspected maybe she was part Native American, maybe she was Hispanic because her maiden name was Gonzalez. And my mom had said anytime as a child, she asked her grandfather, who was your father? Tell me more about him. All he would say was, my father was a Spaniard from Spain, and that was it. He concocted this crazy story about how he was born in El Paso, which I proved to be incorrect. So we knew that there was a story there. I mean, this was a man who was so secretive that he told my mother before he passed away not to run an obituary because he didn't want people showing up at the funeral looking for things, looking for handouts. That's just the type of person he was. So I had a feeling that her ethnicity estimates might raise some red flags, but I didn't know what it would be. And then I discovered that the ethnicity estimates did show these percentages for Africa. And then through the research, I discovered that the family changed their name and that they were all passing as white after they moved to New Orleans. So it's a complicated story, to say the least, but I was able to figure out the story, partially with DNA and partially, just doing the research into the family. Yeah, it's a long-winded explanation.
Yeah, well, that's fine. I had my own long-winded one
fine.
earlier. Thank you for sharing that. So, yeah, so Elizabeth should have taken seriously the fact that she was showing up with African DNA, especially being from that area of the country and knowing that there were a lot of Creoles down there who were of mixed race. It would make sense. So, but yeah, so if you have a tiny percent, 1%, 2% of some other continent, so that they talk about the continents. If you hear a DNA speaker talking and saying, talking about when you should kind of be concerned about your DNA results, maybe not matching your tree, so to speak, it's the continent. So Africa is a different continent than Europe. Asia is a different continent than Europe. Australia is a different continent. North America, South America, those are different continents than Europe. So if you get a different continent in your DNA results, that's something to be concerned about, or not concerned about, but just kind of to be curious about. Why is that happening? Where is that coming from in your family? And you can test different family members. Like the one lady that I know of that came up with 1% African, and she had thought that she was 100% European. She had tested different family members. So she had tested somebody from her mom's side, and she had tested somebody from her dad's side. And she was noticing that it was the people on her dad's side who also had a tiny bit of African DNA. And so she was able to then isolate it to her dad's side. And then she had somebody from her grandma's side and somebody from her grandpa's side test. And she could then isolate that it was the grandma's side, I believe, and so forth. So you can test different family members if you're unsure about where it's coming in, what generation and what side of the family it's coming in on. You may have to test a lot of family members. You might have to test like all your first cousins or something like that to get an idea, but you can do that. Okay, I better move on from this topic because
I see a good question. Can I ask you this question?
Sure.
So Sherry was asking, why does Ancestry group England in with Northern Europe? I don't want an area that broad. So why would the ethnicity estimates give someone such a broad area versus something that's more precise? Why might it do that?
Yeah, as I was saying earlier, I kind of alluded to this, but it's more speculative than precise at this particular time. I think I'm going to say this kind of categorically, and somebody's probably going to get mad at me about it, but I think they cannot determine really very well what a Northern European person looks like. I think the DNA is very similar across all those Northern European countries. So Germany, France, Scandinavia, Netherlands, and the British Isles, they basically kind of meld together. Maybe the people groups in those countries are very closely related, more closely related than we think they are. Maybe they've just been intermarrying so long that their
think
DNA
about the movement of people,
looks,
especially during the medieval era. Just think of the Vikings. I mean, Christ, they went everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think the DNA companies can really tell the difference. I mean, they try. I mean, they're trying, and they will tell you that they're refining their techniques. Whenever they release a new ethnicity estimate, they'll say, oh, this is a better one than we had before, and this is why, and we're doing this new thing and that new thing. And quite frankly, it's gotten better, certainly over the past 10 years, but it's not there yet. at least with my ethnicity. And so I'm thinking that whoever it was that asked that question, oh, Sherry, that's the best that they can do right now.
Well,
That's my answer.
and also, wouldn't the amount of people physically living in those places, those individuals testing, wouldn't that also play a part in it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have the reference population. So every company has what they're going to call reference population. Those people are the people that we're all being compared against. So when they're running our DNA, you know, they get the spit from me. I spit in the bottle, I send it in. They run my DNA through their different test processes, and the processes that they use to figure out my ethnicity is that they run it against the reference population that they already have. And those would be people that can prove that they are English from England and their relatives have lived in England a number of years, you know, like maybe 3 or 4 generations, or that they're Irish from Ireland and their ancestors have been Irish from Ireland for the past 4 or 5 generations. So that's the reference population for England. That's the reference population for Ireland, and so forth. And so they have those for many of the countries, and certainly for the Western European countries, they have a reference population from each country. Now, the Eastern European countries, you could still look on their website and you can see that they don't have a large reference population for places like Latvia and Lithuania and Romania and Bulgaria, some places that are kind of more obscure over in Eastern Europe. They don't have a lot of people doing testing, and maybe they're not able to recruit people over there. I don't exactly know what their procedure is for trying to find people in their reference population, but I know that they have to go and recruit for some areas of the world, like Africa. They're sending, I believe, now this, I may be wrong about this, but I think they're sending out people to kind of recruit people in different places in Africa so they can build up their reference population so it's better. So more people testing, especially from some of the more far-flung areas of the world, will certainly help. But right now, I mean, DNA testing is really an American thing and a British thing. And they're into it, of course, in other places like Australia and Canada and some of those places. But Western Europe are not really into it that much. Eastern Europe, not hardly at all. And then other parts of the world, even less. I think they really have to recruit to get people in their reference populations from Africa and Asia and probably South America. Okay, I got to stop being so long-winded. Gosh. All right. So Katrina, I'm going to kind of answer yours, but let me read it here. Katrina has a question about why she's tested at Ancestry and MyHeritage, and they tell her different things, basically. MyHeritage is telling her that she's a large percentage of Italian. And she doesn't really say that, but I'm wondering if she doesn't have any Italian in her family. And that's what I mean, in her family background that she knows of. And I would say this. Okay, so her ancestry DNA does not mention anything Italian, and doesn't mention anything Southern Europe as well. I was going to say, if Ancestry mentioned something like Southern Europe in any of your results, that could be the Italian kind of masquerading as Southern Europe. But Ancestry doesn't really give you any hints that you have any Southern European, but MyHeritage is saying that you do. And I would say to that's, I can't explain it. If you don't really have, I would think that if you had Italian ancestry, would have picked up on it a little bit. You could also always test at a third company. My suggestion would be 23andMe. Among the 4 companies, You know, they all have strengths and weaknesses, and 23andMe has always had a very good reputation for their ethnicity estimate, for it being perhaps more accurate than some of the other companies. Now, I'm not saying that they are like 100% accurate, because remember, this is an estimate, and none of them are going to be 100% on the money with what your actual ethnicity is, because they can't really calculate it. But I would say maybe Katrina should test at 23andMe if you can, and see what they say. If they don't mention any Italian, and you don't have any Italian in your tree, and you don't have any Italian matches. So if you were really Italian, you know, you should be matching up with a lot of Italian Americans in your match list. And I would say it's probably a fluke that maybe that MyHeritage just kind of got off track there a little bit. That's my explanation. But not knowing further, you know, whether you do have any Italian, it doesn't sound like you do, that you know of. So I would test at a third company to kind of be the tiebreaker, you know, like you've tested at Ancestry, they say no Italian. Tested at MyHeritage, they say 20 or 18% Italian. Do a third company, get them to be the tiebreaker, and then I would say go with that. The best 2 out of 3. Okay, Sheila says, does a 25% ethnicity indicate a grandparent? Well, it depends on what you mean by that, Sheila. I want to know more information about what you're talking about. If you want to sign on and post a little update to that, I could try to answer it a little better. If you are adopted and you're looking for an unknown, you know, all your grandparents are unknown, and you're trying to figure out, you know, like who they could be, the ethnicity report can give you some clues. But it depends on, it depends on what you mean about 25% ethnicity indicated grandparent. Like on mine, if we go back over to mine, I think I'm still sharing my screen, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't have a 25% Scottish grandparent, and I'm 24% Scottish according to this. So, but like I said, I should be 25% Eastern European. And because my other 3 grandparents are not Eastern European at all, I really expected to have a 25% or around 25% Eastern European here to reflect that grandmother. And yes, through other DNA testing and other research, she is really my grandmother. I mean, there's not a question of that. And sometimes there is a question of that. And so, you know, especially with a grandfather, there are a number of people who have determined from DNA testing that their grandfather that, you know, was in their life, and they thought he was their biological grandfather. He turned out not to be, because they figured it out through DNA testing. So certainly those kinds of surprises can come up, but I've already done the research, and my grandmother really is my grandmother biologically. It just isn't showing up in my DNA as 25%. But remember, it did show up that I could be up to 19% Eastern European. So yeah, Sheila, did Sheila get back on and say anything more about that? No. Okay.
Oh,
well,
wait.
Sheila,
Yes, she did. Just now. Okay. She said, I have 2 grandparents from Ireland, 50% on 4 companies, 25% Polish. And she said that her grandmother was born there, and 25% Italian, which is new in the last few years. She
says, my grandfather spoke, and then she stopped typing. Okay. Get back on, Sheila.
I will say this, my dad's DNA, he has one set of grandparents. So his paternal grandparents, both of them were from Ireland, and it says 55%. So what she's saying, as far as I have 2 grandparents from Ireland and it's 50% on 4 companies, that tracks.
Yep. So it looks like she stopped though in the middle of typing something. Okay, yeah. My grandfather spoke German and was born in Silesia, not Poland. Okay. Okay, so are you saying, Sheila, then that all 4 companies are saying that you're part Italian? Is that what they're saying? Because if so, then that would be significant. Or, yeah, so Sheila still needs to update us on that. So we'll come back to her in a second here. Okay, Terry says something along the similar lines. I just want to kind of, say something about each of you if I can. So Terry says, on Ancestry, I do not have any Ireland listed at all, but on Family Tree DNA, it lists 43% Ireland for my ethnicity. What would be an explanation for this? I would wonder on Ancestry if you have this England and Northwestern Europe tab here. This includes Ireland. Even though there's a separate Ireland category down here on Ancestry, and Scotland. Scotland can also include Ireland. If we look at the maps, so let me go ahead and click onto England, Northwest Europe for you. And even though it doesn't really show that, I think a lot of people that are Irish are sometimes being counted in this England section here. We go back to Ireland on Ancestry.
I can show my dad's as an example.
It's not really showing that
massively
either.
Irish.
Yeah. I think based on what she said,
she did. So Sheila did come back and say that the 4 companies differ a little bit, but not her siblings. I assume she means not like her siblings haven't changed, their ethnicity estimates haven't changed much.
Sheila, we're still waiting for some clarification from Sheila.
I will say this, and someone brought this up in the chat. I think this is important to address, is that your ethnicity estimates between siblings can look different because of what you inherit from each of your parents. Right. So like my dad, it doesn't say he's from Norway, that he doesn't have any percentages from Norway, but my aunt does. But it just has to do with how it's all who inherits what traits.
They inherit it from the parents. Yeah. Okay. So Sheila, clarifying that my question for you is, okay.
She said that
which company is telling you that you're 25% Italian? And are all 4 companies telling you that you're about 25% Italian, or just one company? So that would be the question. So you said that you've tested at 4 companies, and I'm wanting to know if all of them are saying that you're 25% Italian, or if just one of them is. And if only one of them, which company is it? All right, so let's go back up to the top. And so Terry, I would just say that, and remember that the different companies are going to be calculating a little differently. So Family Tree DNA is going to be calculating their Irish, Scottish, European, or Northern European categories a little differently than Ancestry would. And that's probably the explanation.
Do you mind if I share my screen really quick?
Just go ahead. Get out of mine, or do I need to stop?
No.
Mine? Okay, you got the power.
I have all the power. So I wanted to show you my dad's ethnicity estimate just because he's massively Irish, as you can tell. But this, because I saw that somebody in the chat said that they have a high percentage of England / Northwestern Europe on Ancestry and also Scotland, but they weren't sure if that included Ireland. So you're going to have, historically speaking, a lot of back and forth between this area of continental Europe and England. You're also going to have some back and forth between this area of continental Europe and also Ireland during the early modern period. So this is kind of why sometimes maybe doing a little bit of social history research can be beneficial as far as maybe giving you some potentials of why might this be popping up, but also, as Sarah has said many times, it's a computer algorithm. It could just be nothing. You have anything to add to that? Does that make sense?
Nope, that's fine. Let's keep going to the more questions here.
I'll stop sharing my screen if you want to.
Yeah, I can restart sharing mine. Get back over there. Okay, so let's see if we can knock out a bunch more questions. Did Sheila get back with us again?
She did. She said Ancestry, My Heritage, and she'd have to look up for 23andMe. Sheila, how about you send us an email, because I think Sarah could probably unpack this a little bit through email.
I'm based on what Sheila's saying, it almost sounds like she has an Italian grandfather instead of a Polish grandfather, because they're very different places and they would have very different DNA. But I hesitate to say that without all the information, but that's kind of what it's sounding like from what you're saying. Okay. Okay, so Sadie is saying she has almost all Northern European, and then Ancestry lists her as less than 1% Benin Togo. When I click on it, it says I have 0%. Yeah, I mean, it could be a fluke. I would almost, Sadie, say that you should test at the other companies, especially at 23andMe, because 23andMe has detected a tiny bit of African in me. And I'm inclined to think they also found it in my mother and my sister. So I'm inclined to think that we all three have it, and it's from my mother's side of the family. So I'd be interested to see if you tested at 23andMe, if you did get a tiny percentage of African as well. And 23andMe will give you a timetable. They'll say like, this could have been in the 1700s that this ethnicity came into your line. I'm going to switch over to 23andMe real quick here and show you mine. Let's see here. I want to go to ancestry composition. So 23andMe calls it ancestry composition. And you can see here that I'm 99.2% European, but I have this tiny bit of African. And my mother and my sister also have it because they've also tested at 23andMe. So that's why I'm inclined to think it is something is there. I don't know what. It's probably pretty far back in time. And my mother's side has a lot of Southern ancestors. So that's our thinking as well, is that somebody in our family was intermarried with, or, mated with somebody who was African sometime in the South in the US. We don't know who, and I could try to do more testing to try to figure it out. I think I have it figured out that it's my grandpa's side, and we don't have a lot of living relatives on my grandpa's side. So it would be difficult for me to kind of test more people without kind of going far afield in the family to try to figure it out. But I could probably work on that. Okay, so that was Sadie. Ed says, are there particular testing companies that specialize in particular ethnicities? Living DNA is associated with UK and Ireland. I think they're really the only one that is like recommended. There are some others. There's one out there that's called African DNA, but I've seen people kind of give them mixed reviews. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest that you go there if you're trying to figure out your African DNA. I would say stick with the big four, and probably Ancestry or 23andMe would be the better ones of the four for ethnicity results. Okay, Kay says, I have indigenous Americas showing up as 1%. My grandfather was French Canadian. How can I confirm if it's anything? Well, again, this 1% is probably pretty far back on your line, Kay. I think you're probably right. If you had French Canadians, they were definitely the early French Canadian men that came to France, were traders and trappers and adventurers, and a lot of them, there were not a lot of European women up there, so a lot of them did marry Native women. And so it is entirely possible. You might be able to figure this out by genealogical research, just because there's a lot of data out there on the French Canadians, the early French Canadians. And many of the Native women were baptized into the Catholic Church with their husband, and the children would have been baptized into the Catholic Church. So you might be able to figure that out. I would say it's probably something, but it's going to be, 1700s, 1600s. So whether you can actually figure it out, like exactly who it was, I don't know, but it's theoretically possible. Yeah. Okay.
A related question.
Mhm.
Another person had asked what your opinion on Native American DNA, which we did kind of bring up the Indian princess thing, and someone said in the
Well,
chat.
I mean, yeah, what do
Yeah.
they mean by my opinion? If you test Native American, then yeah, then you are. You would be indigenous America. I don't think the DNA companies are really that great yet with determining whether you're Central, Southern, or Northern American. And I think there was a lot of fluidity between those different groups.
They're better for countries like Cuba. So like my father-in-law has some decent percentages for indigenous Cuba, indigenous Puerto Rico, indigenous Mexico specifically.
Mhm.
So I think they're getting better, but his DNA, it didn't break up into those until this most recent
To the communities, yeah.
Yeah. Which somebody had asked, which company do you think is best for Native American DNA stuff?
Well, Ancestry has really good communities. So the communities will tell you, like, you're indigenous from this area of Mexico. And then you can actually look up and see what indigenous tribes were in that area of Mexico. So that's a helpful tool at Ancestry. I don't think 23andMe may break it down quite that way. I don't have indigenous DNA, so I haven't seen what 23andMe does with it, but I would say between those two, I would probably go if you were trying to find indigenous Native DNA to the Americas. A lot of times people want to know what tribe they were from, and the tests cannot tell you that. They're going to tell you that you're indigenous, but there's, I don't know, hundreds of tribes maybe. And the only way you can really figure out the tribe is from research, or if the family knows, or, that type of thing. The DNA test is not going to tell you, oh, you're Navajo. Oh, you're Cherokee. It's not going to do that. And it can't really. It just is just differentiating between, like I said, the continents, really, like European versus non-European, and then what your non-European is. So, yeah.
So Kelsey, the person who asked what your opinion was on Native American DNA, she followed up by saying that the three companies show no DNA for American Indian.
For her. So she had a story maybe about that in her family. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on Native American DNA, but stories that I have heard from people basically would be that maybe you're Native American, maybe you are Native American, but it's so far back in your tree, and the original person that was, you know, full Native American is like 10 generations back. And then, you know, it didn't filter up to you, all the way up to you. That could certainly be the case. Unfortunately, we get a lot of people here at the Genealogy Center, and I've had given some DNA consultations to some of these people who the story is that the Native American is much closer, you know, to modern day. You know, they're saying, oh, my grandmother was a Native American. My great grandmother was Native American. And they always say she was full, you know, she was full Native American. And if that were the case, that would show up in your DNA. There's just no question about that. So something's gone wrong there. I don't know what it is. I can't tell them, but I can say, you know, if your grandmother was full Native American, fully indigenous, no other ethnicities mixed in there, then you would be 25% Native American, and you're not. So I don't know what to tell you, but something's not adding up here. Maybe grandma was only a smidgen Native American, you know, maybe she was only, you know, 5% or something like that, and you didn't happen to inherit that 5% from grandma. That's certainly a possibility. There's a lot of other possibilities, you know, with the stories that a lot of people have in the oral histories that people have in their family. Sometimes they just don't turn out to be true. So, and that could be part of it as well. I don't know, but yeah.
Sometimes I feel like the existence of the story to begin with is a story in itself. You know, why was this a story that was passed down? And that just leads you to more questions, but they're the types of questions I like to think about.
Phyllis asked about Oriental countries. I think she means Asian countries. So there's a category on the DNA results that would be Asian, Phyllis, and that would be what would be your traditional like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, those countries.
Somebody did ask a question about whether or not it was true that France won't let them do a DNA test. It has been illegal in France since 1994. I Googled it.
There are a couple of countries like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
People get around it by taking DNA tests over to France and giving them to people that they want to test, and then taking the test back to the US and mailing it in. So people are kind of circumventing that a little bit, but yeah, it's not being done over there very much because of the law.
I put a link in the chat to an article that explains that, just because, you know, I Google these things.
Okay, Amanda says, can you use ethnicity to narrow down and try to find a missing ancestor? For example, if you knew your great-grandfather's location and time, but not a name. Maybe. You have to be real careful about that. I had somebody that I was helping the other day, and she didn't have any Irish in her tree at all. But then she had this unknown ancestor that turned out to be Irish. And so the rest of her tree, I should explain that a little better. She had, like, let's say she had all 8 of her great-grandparents. She had 7 of 8 of her great-grandparents. So she knew 7 of them, and that none of those 7 were Irish. She had an unknown great-grandparent that was the 8th great-grandparent. And so she was getting these Irish matches, and she had determined that they must be from this unknown great-grandparent. And so she was able to kind of sort her DNA matches based on them being Irish, but she also used the shared matches tool. So you want to be sure you're doing that as well. You don't want to be misled by a false lead of an ethnicity when, so if you find somebody that you know is actually on this, you know, unknown great-grandparent's line, you want to do the shared matches tool with that person and make sure that these other matches that you're looking at are also listed there. But you can kind of follow a trail of an ethnicity. If it's a really specific ethnicity that you didn't have in the rest of your tree, you could do that with some of your matches with an unknown ancestor, yes. But you want to be careful that you don't, like I said, go off the rails with it.
It seems like that would be a last ditch effort.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
because it sounds like it would be a heavy lift to do it.
Yeah. Okay, Robin says something. She has the opposite of, I guess, the earlier person that was talking about Ancestry shows me as 18% Sicilian, and then my heritage doesn't make me Italian at all. I'm going to say I've had enough people tell me that my heritage either made them Italian or subtracted their Italian out of their ethnicity that should have been there. I'm going to say that maybe my heritage has a little Italian problem. And that would be my theory based on what I'm seeing tonight and what I've heard from people in the past. So if you're having funky results with my heritage saying that you're Italian or not saying that you're Italian, maybe just kind of, and you've tested at the other companies and it's not going on there, I would say that that's just funkiness related to my heritage and not really anything to be truly worried about. Let me look at my heritage. I feel like they might have made me Italian as well.
Well, I mean, Robin also brought up that my heritage, while it doesn't categorize them as Italian Sicilian, it does have 20% Sephardic Jewish. And somebody can correct me if I'm off base here, but weren't there Sephardic people that ended up in Italy after the Inquisition?
Well, yeah, they were in Spain.
Right. And then they left. Some went to Greece and Turkey.
Yeah, that could be. It could be.
Yeah.
Again, if she's not showing up as Jewish at any other of the databases, I'd be a little skeptical about that as well. Okay, so my heritage is not making me Italian after all. I thought they were, but they're not. Okay. All right, let me go back to the questions. I'm trying to get through
which this is a good time for me to bring up. If we do not get to all of your wonderful questions this evening, send us an email. We're always happy to answer questions. Sarah's always happy to answer questions. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info, which I'm going to put that in the chat. So yeah, definitely send us an email if we don't get to your question this evening, or if you come to a question in the middle of the night while you're thinking about this program.
Okay, Amanda asked a similar question about African-American genealogy. Is ethnicity useful? I would say probably not. It would be helpful if you're finding, it depends on what you mean by that. If you're finding, if you're mostly African-American, if you identify as an African-American, and you're looking for, and you keep finding matches to Caucasian European people, then that would be useful in trying to track those families and trying to correlate them together to see whether you can find out how all the European people that you match, how they relate to each other. Because if you can do that, that's indicating to you that you might have found the enslavers of your family, perhaps. Certainly, you're sharing DNA with these European people. So that would be helpful. So I'm not sure if that's what you meant, Amanda, but that would be helpful, yes. Okay, Barbara says something about 30 Native American in 2017. And then I don't know if she means 30%.
I assume she means 30%.
And she said it's gone away now. I wonder if it said 0.3% or 3%. If it said, I think Ancestry used to show tiny amounts and then they stopped showing them. So I'm wondering if it showed her with a really tiny amount. I don't know, Barbara, since you don't have it anymore on your ethnicity, I can't really speak to that, but I would test at another company, like especially at 23andMe, and see if you have any Native American with them. That would be my next step for you. Okay. Joan or Joni says, how far back do you inherit DNA from grandparents? So it's basically going in half each generation back. And so, you have 50% of your DNA from your parents, 25% from your grandparents, 12.5% from the great grandparents, and so forth. And so it gets back to about 6 or 7 generations, and then it's really tiny amounts of DNA. So at some point, it just is not measurable anymore. And people will say that they have found matches that are descended from their 6th or 7th great grandparents, and that may be true. I don't find a lot of matches that go back that far. And I think that that's just because I didn't inherit enough DNA from that particular grandparent.
Okay, so we are just about out of time. So thanks everybody again for joining us. This has been fun. If you have more questions, like I said, just send us an email. I put our email address in the chat a couple times. But I will do it again. It is genealogy@acpl.info.
And especially the lady that we were talking to, was it Sheila?
Sheila, yeah.
Yeah, Sheila, do get in touch with us if you want me to look into that further, because that sounds very intriguing and I want to help you try to get to the bottom of it if we can.
Great. Well, thanks again, everybody. And thank you, Sarah, for sharing all of your wonderful knowledge with us.
You're welcome.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.